week. I will not make the promise that I will, but if I do, then after that, Master Cameron would be up. But that's only in December, and that will be Judges and Ruth, right? No, just the Judges, I'll do Ruth. He's scared of the romance in Ruth. Chesed, yes. Right, Joshua chapter 1. Thus far we've seen, if they can get the basic overview up and don't scroll yet. Can I get the scrolly thing so that I've got control over it? If you don't have it ready, it's no problem. Okay. So thus far we've covered the first 5 books of the Old Testament, known as the Pentateuch, and what God is doing with that through Moses is establishing a worldview for Israel, fundamental worldview that includes a self-revelation, which is Genesis chapters 1 through 3, God's design of covenant in terms of what his plan is, which is rolled out in Abraham, established in Genesis but rolled out in Abraham. And then this plan will ultimately be fulfilled not only when Israel enters the land, that's not fully fulfilled then, but also God's plan is expanding as things move towards the proto-evangelion of Genesis 3:15, the first gospel preached concerning the coming seed. So that's where God is going in order for him to fulfill the Redeemer, the fulfillment or the coming of the Redeemer. There are certain things that need to take place. There needs to be a people. There needs to be a line, a seed, a promise. And so God builds this framework that he's working with Israel. That is what Deuteronomy, that is what the Pentateuch is about, is God establishing the framework and his future plans, not only for Israel, but also for the world. You find God's inclusion of the Gentiles in Deuteronomy. A lot of people miss that. God's hardening of Israel for a short period of time is also in Deuteronomy. And then God's future fulfillment is all expanded from this time onward. In the book of Joshua, we see God's faithfulness is magnified. He's now established the framework of how they need to think about him. He's established the framework for what his plan is. He's given them the plot line. I'm going to give you a land. I'm going to give you a seed. I'm going to give you a people. That is the promise to Abraham. God made a statement. I don't believe it's a covenant in Genesis, in creation, but he made a promise to Adam that they will fill the earth and have dominion over it. It's a promise, but not a covenant. The word berith is an important word in Old Testament covenants. When you don't see that word, then don't presume a covenant exists. Often people speak about covenants that does not have that word berith in it, and so those are not actual covenants, but it's theological covenants. For instance, the covenant of works, the covenant of grace, there is no such thing. There is a new covenant, and there is the covenant with Abram, there is a covenant with David, there is a covenant with Noah, there is a covenant with the Levites, there's a Palestinian covenant, but there is no covenant of works, covenant of grace. What's the other one? They have a third one that some covenantals use. Covenant of law, I think. I forget the other one. But there are no covenants outside the biblical covenants, which not generally, always has the word berith or covenant in it. So, in Joshua, God now establishes who he is in terms of his covenants. He's made the covenant, he's told him what he was going to do, and now he's starting to fulfill that promise. There are 2 things that is very prominent in this, or 3 things that is very prominent in this book: land, people, and rest. Those are important. land, which is Israel, Canaan, people, the people of Israel, and rest. All of those goes back to where? Why are those things important? What up? Can't hear you. Okay, yes, the covenants with Abraham and Noah. Interestingly, Noah's name, Noach, and Nuachim, it's both the same. One is a noun, one is a verb. What do you think it means? Rest. There was an expectation of rest in Noah. And Noah's father, Lamech, says, surely this one will give us relief, rest from our labors. There was expectation that Noah would be the one to bring relief. The earth was groaning, the people were groaning in pain and suffering, and they needed a savior. The presumption is that the Lord would send somebody to do that. That is still the presumption during this period of history, that there would be rest. And in Genesis chapter 2, end of 1, God rested from all his work. And it's better to understand that to mean that God ceased from working or creating. That's all that means. It doesn't mean that God sat down and was tired. But the idea of rest, the idea of Sabbath, is a theological idea. God establishes that there will be a period of rest and not just a day of rest. He establishes the day in Genesis, but the period is what is after, that there will be a cessation of all man's labors, where man will live dependently on God and you don't have to work the soil anymore. That is prefigured for us in Genesis, where we are to enjoy the land. There is no need to till the ground because God will provide fruit from it. Okay, so in Joshua, we enter the land. There's a lot of echoes back to what God has promised, and so pay attention to that. So as we begin, let's read verse 1 through to 3. I'm looking for somebody. He's not here. Okay. After the death of Moses, servant of Yahweh, Yahweh said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' assistant, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now go. Or therefore, now go. Go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I'm giving to them, to the people of Israel. Every place, take note of this, that the sole of your foot will tread on, I have given to you, just as I have promised to Moses. Does anybody know where the book of Joshua fits into the Torah, the Jewish books of the Bible? Is it history? Is it law? Is it prophets? Or is it writings? What do you think? I don't know what you said. You think? It's in the history books. Okay. I saw another hand. Somebody disagree with that? In the Protestant versions, it's in the history books. It's actually in the prophetical books. That's interesting, right? Doesn't sound prophetic at all, since it records. So that is a question and a debate among scholars. Why did what is it in it that sees this book as prophetic, since it records? Now, with Hebrew grammar, what determines translation, how you translate a verb, is the genre in which the book is found. And so that is a crucial element to determine. If this is prophetic, then a lot of these verbs will naturally be translated as future, and rightly so. In verse 3, it is not rightly so. In verse 3, it is translated as a past action in English, a action that has done. Um, I promised and I have given, although it could be I will give as I have promised. And so it could mean that God is about to fulfill because I haven't entered the land yet. And so I would take that verb um, to mean that every where the sole of your foot will tread upon, I will give. That's a promise to you, just as I promise. And so you can take it as have given, that gives more of a perfect um, sense that yes, God has already fulfilled it, but the tense in Hebrew is not actually there. And so I think because I promised uh, can be better represented by I will give than I have given. But either way you take it, it is okay. And you will notice, Hebrew scholars, that that often is a challenge in translation. So I'll tell you when to move on. So go back to just where you get basic overview on top. Right. Now, before we get into the theology of the book, let's get the big picture perspective of the book. And so now the next slide. Now, next slide, but then just the blue part and not the bottom part. Because otherwise people will write. So keyword authorship, that's all that I'm wanting up. Is it good? So if you go one back. Oh, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Okay. Um, Authorship. Actually, let's begin with keyword. Occupation is often given as the keyword for the book. Conquest, but I think it's probably best to see it as God's faithfulness. And you will see that Joshua's focus more often than not is on God, on his faithfulness, on his promise. He always goes back to as he promised to Moses or as he said to our fathers. And so I want to be faithful to that even as we outline the the keyword of this book. So you could take occupation, conquest, or God's faithfulness. I will accept any one of that in the quiz. So authorship, there's external aspects in authorship. Jewish tradition has Joshua. It ascribes it to him. The Talmud says that Joshua wrote all but the last 5 verses in this book. Internal witnesses, look at chapter 8, verse 32. um, says, and in the presence of the people of Israel, this is Joshua, and you'll see him in the beginning of verse 30. And at that time, Joshua built an altar, and so the he refers back to him. He wrote on the stones a copy of the law of Moses, which he had written. So God gives Joshua the right to copy the law. Now, why is that important? First of all, as the next leader, now would be leader of Israel, of the Jews, he needs to know what God says in the law. And so he is given the responsibility to copy the law, the same as the kings. They were supposed to be copyists of the law. Ever wonder why we have so many copies of the Bible? God preserved his word. And sometimes these writers, the prophets, the people who wrote the Bible made multiple copies. And God ultimately designed it that way so that there would be a legacy, an ongoing legacy of these documents. Yeah, it is written on stone. The clarity of that is not exact. Does it mean another stone tablet, or does it mean, because it's plural, that he made multiple stones as he copied it? The latter is probably true, that he copied it a few times, and you obviously have to get it right. It doesn't say that he wrote the book of Joshua here, but the author is present in some of the events that is written. Look at Joshua chapter 5. What I wanted to point out there is that Joshua does have the right to copy God's word, gives him the right to be somewhat of an author of God's word. And you see that later on. Look at chapter 5, verse 1. As soon as all the kings of the Amorites were beyond, who were beyond the Jordan to the west, and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea heard that Yahweh had dried up the waters of the Jordan of the people of Israel until they had crossed over, their hearts melted, and there was no longer any. Why do I have chapter 5? There was no longer any spirit in them because of the people of Israel. Maybe I had a different verse in mind. Let me see. What I'm pointing out is that the author is actually an eyewitness of these events. Look at verse 6. For the people of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness until all the nation of the men of war who came out of Egypt perished because they did not obey the voice of Yahweh. And Yahweh swore to them that he would not let them see the land that Yahweh had sworn to their fathers to give to us, a land flowing with milk and honey. So the point is that he was witness of the events, and he writes as if he's experiencing the events. You also see that Rahab, by the time of this writing, is still alive. Chapter 6, verse 25. He says, Rahab, the prostitute, and her father's household, and all who belonged to her, Joshua saved alive, and she has lived in Israel to this day. So the time of this writing, it means that she's still alive, and also the person writing this very point is still alive as he's writing it, because she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent by spy out of Jericho. Joshua doesn't mention himself as an author. He doesn't mention himself as an author. What also is notable is the last 2 points. The inhabitants, or the names of the places, is still the old names. So he's familiar with the old names as they move into Canaan. He doesn't change the name, like for instance, Kiriath Arba. That only gets changed, Hebron, later on. The Jebusites are still inhabitants of Jerusalem in chapter 15, so he knows about it, and so he can write about it as first-hand experiencer, one that experiences it in a vivid language. Sure. Yeah. It's to the day of this writing. And so at the time of his penning of this document, and we don't know exactly the time period when he pens it, but it doesn't matter. It does seem that Joshua is the author, and I mean, there's a big debate about it. It doesn't matter. It's authored by God, and God has given it as inspired text, and so we will receive it as that. I like the term inscripturated text, and that's what we have in the book of Joshua. Joshua was born a slave in Egypt, interestingly. He was there when Moses and the people of Israel left. He was 40 years old when he left, and he was 8 years old when he began to lead. He was an old guy, right? We would think so. But he doesn't act like an old man, because he's part of the guys that goes and fight. Yes, he was a spy when he's 40 years old, probably closer to 70 at that stage, but maybe 40. But when he enters Canaan, the dude is 80 years old, and they still have to go to fight. I think he probably had a lot of energy. The Lord had given him a long life. I believe he died at 110, right? Joshua had a long life that God has given him. He led the nation for 30 years until there it is at the age of 110 in Joshua 24:29. Okay, next slide. Sorry about the Hebrew doesn't show up. Just go to the next slide. That starts with title. Yeshua doesn't show up. No, I should have probably sent him a PDF. Would have been better. Literally means Yahweh saves, or Yahweh is salvation. His name was Hoshea, salvation, but it's transliterated as Yeshua, or Yahweh saves. The key verse is Joshua 1, verse 8, and it's a memory verse or a Bible verse or a life verse of many people. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, and that's not what they would put on their mantle, but notice the last part where it says, for then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. And then verse 9, have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous, do not be frightened, and do not be dismayed, for Yahweh your God will be with you wherever you go. And so that last two verses are generally used by people as favorite verses, but notice where it begins. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth. What do you think of by now when you hear mouth? So when you teach it, it's not your words, it's what is supposed to dominate your heart that comes out of your mouth. So don't let it depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate. Where do you meditate? Mind and heart. It was one to the Jewish mind. Meditated day and night, so that you may be careful to do all that is written in it. For then, having meditated day and night, then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. Why does that sound familiar? Where do you hear that phraseology elsewhere? Psalm 1. And David is actually quoting Joshua. Listen carefully. And his delight is in the law of the Lord. And on his law, he meditates day and night. And notice how he explains what happens. And like a tree planted by the streams of water, that yields its fruit in season, and its leaf does not wither, in all that he does, he what? Prospers. That's exactly the same as what Joshua is saying. And that's God's command, God's instruction to Joshua for prosperous life, for a life of holiness, a life that would honor him, is to spend time in the word, to not let the word depart from his mouth, which means heart, to not let it be separated from the direction of his life. And if that is the case, if he conducts his life in accordance with the word of God, then only will he have success, and then only will he truly prosper. Purpose. To describe how the Lord gave to Israel the land that he had promised in the Abrahamic covenant, which he meted out while meting out punishment on the inhabitants of the land for their extreme wickedness, but also to chronicle Israel's failure to possess the land completely because of failure to obey all the Lord's commands. I should have said Yahweh's commands. It is important to note that it is focused on God's giving of the land, God's fulfillment of his promises, and Israel's inability to completely take all of the land. And we'll see that in a moment's time. All right. So, what is the book about? Next slide. You could outline it in the following ways. Partial occupation of Canaan. Next slide. Is it up? Yes? Okay, then on your left, I presume, on my left, your right. Conquering the land, chapters 1 to 12. Dividing the land, chapters 13 to 24. You could have it faith demonstrated or faith rewarded. That is from Jensen's Old Testament survey. If you go to the next slide, just keep the two partitions in mind. I'd actually wait on that slide. Go back so people can write it down. Chapters 1 to 12, conquering the land, dividing the land. So keep that two sections in mind. 1 to 12, conquering, 13 to 24, dividing the land. Key factors in this book: Jordan, Canaan, and the two tribes, and then the two eastern tribes and the 9 western tribes, which you see developing at this stage. They spend at least a month at Jordan, plus minus 7 years, and then the occupation as they move further north, both the eastern and the western tribes starts to take shape. That takes about 18 years. Chapters 1 through 5 is the preparation. Chapters 6 through 12 is the process in which they start to take hold of the land. Chapter 13 to 21 is the partitioning of the land. And then chapter 22 to 24, principles. You have to have 4 P's, right? You can't just have 3. The principles is actually God, through Joshua, just reaffirming the promises he's made. So we will look at that. It's a very interesting section. Joshua speaks about me and my house. We know that verse, right? We will serve the Lord. And often election and human will is brought into the equation. I think there's a lot of weight in that passage to speak about God's desire for man and man's inability, because Joshua actually responds and he says to them, no, you can't. You can't serve the Lord, but we will serve. And we will look at that word serve when we get to it. So Israel is about to enter the land. They need a reminder of who God is and what God has done for them. So I'm going to give you a general outline, and then I'm going to give you, after the general outline, the theological outline. And I think it's important to make this distinction. They need to be reminded about who God is and what he has promised them. And that's what God does in chapter 1. Notice in verse 5, he says, no man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you, and I will not forsake you. That could also be translated as, I am not leaving you, and I am not forsaking you. Either way, the tense of the verb or the sense of the verb carries the idea that God is promising to be with him in a more personal, ongoing way. So the reaffirmation of God's promise to them is given, first to Joshua and then to the nation. Now, in the general outline, can you move on to the next slide, please? The general outline. This is often how you can go through all 4, or if all 4 shows up, that's fine. This is generally how the book is broken up. Entering the promised land is chapters 1 through 5. Conquering the promised land is chapters 6 to 12. Distributing the promised land is 13 to 22. And then retaining the promised land is 23 to 24. When I started, I said this book is about what? God's faithfulness. If you making notes, I will give you a moment to write it down, but I will mention the theological outline, which is on the next slide. And it focuses on God. Before we move on. You got it? Good, let's move on. I'm going by your typing. Theological slide. Theological outline, sorry. I think it's better to break it up in the following way. God conquers, chapters 1 through to 12. God divides, 13 to 21. And God's promise remains, because it's a reaffirmation of the promise, in 22 through to 24. A lot of the time, the focus is on Joshua as a man of God. And you'll hear sermons on, we need to be a Joshua generation. We need to be the next Joshua. We have to have Joshua's faith. The book is not about Joshua. The book is not about Israel conquering the land. The book is about God's faithfulness, how God conquers. And you'll see it from the first battle. It is God that fights for Israel. It's a tremendously significant moment, their first battle. And then after they get into the land, after they get into the land, what takes place, what God expects them to do, just exposes them. And God does it for a very specific reason, because God is the one that ultimately decides what happens in his land. And so God divides, God conquers, God divides, and then God's promise remains, which means he's the one that will fulfill his promise. He will keep on fulfilling it. Okay. Is there a problem with the slides? No. Okay. Can we move on to historical context? Okay. Any questions or comments thus far? Yes, sir. Oh, yes, son. Sorry. You're going to have to speak up. Okay, while you're thinking, let me just finish the slide. I have a time for Q&A just after this occasion. So Moses died after leading Israel 40 years in the wilderness, and Joshua took over to lead God's people so that they may take possession of the land that God has promised. However you speak about the task, the work, the functions, the activities of Joshua, always bring it back to God. I should say that about every book in the Old Testament. It should always come back to God, because the Bible is God's self-revelation. So, in this book, the nation experiences the partial fulfillment. I would highlight that if you're writing it up. Partial fulfillment of the promise of the land that stems back to Abraham nearly 600 years earlier in Genesis 12, verse 1 and 7. It is, God is starting to fulfill the promise he made to Abraham. Land, seed, nation, and then a people that will be blessed through that seed. So this is the beginning stages of God bringing about eschatological hope, eschatological fulfillment. So as we work through this, keep in mind this is partial fulfillment. Now you will read in Joshua that all that God has promised has been fulfilled by the hand of Joshua. And that may be confusing. Hang on, if all that God has promised has been fulfilled, why am I saying partial fulfillment? And you'll see why I say partial fulfillment later on. Okay, so next we will consider the chapter evaluation, question, and Q&A. Questions or comments? Did you have a question? Yeah. I can't hear you, buddy. Speak up. I have no idea what you're saying. What chapter are you in? Yeah, we can. We can. I don't need to have a loud enough voice. While we are doing that, does anybody know what happened to Natasha? Is she okay? Or is it just oh, the family sick? Okay, good. I mean, not good, but thank you. Go ahead, Joshua.
1, 2. It says that
Where?
in Joshua 24,
Yeah.
verse 26.
Verse 26, my eyes can't focus on it. There you go. And Joshua wrote the words in the book of the law of God. Oh, yes. And he took a large stone and set it there under the terebinth that is by the sanctuary of Yahweh. That's a good connection there. Yes. What's happening here is, remember I mentioned that he is given the right to copy the law, which gives him the right to be an author. God gives him the right to be an author. And here, notice what it says. Joshua wrote these words. What is these words? The words of this book. In the book of the law of God. What is that? Adding to the writings of God. So he's not adding to the law, but it's written in the books of the law, which means God is now expanding his written literature, his books. And so, yes, I don't know if I had it in my notes, but I did want to make that connection, that he was given the right to write the books of, at least this book. It is these words that is in view. It's this book. All right. Anything else? Right, let's move on. Joshua chapter 1 through to 4. I will get as far as I can, and then we'll see when we can end. There are a couple of maps here, but I think it's important that you understand why I say partial fulfillment. Oftentimes people, do we have a little pointy thingy? What's wrong with you? You just have to go up there and use my finger. Okay, so can we get one, please? Because I'm going to need that for the future. The first point here, if you can go to the next slide, where it says Joshua 1 through to 4, slide 11. Okay, Joshua is about God advancing his plan. Notice that you see in verse 2, God initiates the discussion with Joshua. Moses, my servant, is dead. Now, therefore, arise, go. And translation says, go over this Jordan, go through the Jordan, over the Jordan, go to the Jordan. Any of those are acceptable. The idea here is that he needs to respond. Joshua does not jump into action, and we don't know why. There's a lot of suspicion. He was scared. I don't think so. I think that the transition, the mourning of Moses, is still in play. The transition, he's still getting used to his new position, so he's still thinking about what's our next step. So he rightfully is waiting on God, and it's God that initiates action. Why? Because God is the one that actually advances his plan forward. It's not Joshua, it is not Israel, it is God that's moving Israel into his direction. Notice over and over in this section, if you can think of a camera lens that's zooming, it pans and then zooms in on God. Verse 6, be strong, speaking to Joshua, and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land. Take notice of the word land comes up, promise comes up. But look how it pans back to God, that I swore to their fathers to give to them. Only be strong and very courageous. Again, speaking to Joshua, being careful to do according to the law that Moses, my servant, commanded you. Do not turn to the right or to the left, that you may have good success wherever you go. So, in other words, go in the direction that my word, my law, allows you to go. This book shall not depart from you. You go right to the end, verse 9. For I have commanded you, and be strong. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened, and do not be dismayed. For Yahweh your God is with you wherever you go. Again, the camera pans towards God. I'm talking to you, but the focus is on me. I am with you. I've made a promise. I will fulfill all that I have done. All the lessons in the book of Joshua points to God. and look at verse 10, and I'll come back to this in a moment's time. And Joshua commanded the officials and of the peoples, pass through the midst of the camp and command the people, prepare your provisions, for within 3 days you shall pass over this Jordan to go in and take possession, that relates back to the promise, of the land that Yahweh your God is giving or has given or will give you to possess. Again, he knows his duty. He gives the duty to the people, but the direction of the camera, again, ends on God. It is God that is fulfilling what he has promised to us. And you will see this over and over and over. And there's a reason why God pops up almost in every verse here, every second verse here, is to show that God is the one who initiates the entrance of the land. It is his choice, his will to give this land to the people of Israel, and he's the one that will provide the land to them. It is not by their strength, it is not by their power, it is not by their ability to win the wars. It is God alone that is able to do this. Now, the next element in the historical context is to understand the scope of the land. Go back to verse 3. The next slide will have a map on it, and on the left side of the on the right side of the slide, on top, it should say the world of Abraham, around about 2000 BC. Can you see that? Oh my goodness, that is small. Are you able to zoom? Do you have that capacity? Oh, it's not a touchscreen? Wat gaat aan? So if you do this with your mouse, you can't on the mouse pad? Do you have a mouse? Can you scroll, keep control and scroll forward? Oh, it doesn't matter. I think I will just tell you. Okay, so let's read verse 3. And I want you to take note what God says very carefully here. Every place, I will put this on the group. There you go. So get in and then Memphis, if you don't mind. So between your Zoom, on the right, on your left, and then Memphis on the right. And then I'll okay, there you go. Read verse 3 with me. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread on, I have given you. I struggle with the way that this has been translated. Every soul, now it's future, that your foot will tread on. I have given you, just as I promised. Okay, so what are we doing here with the translation? Is it past, is it present? I think what God is saying is that every place that your sole of your foot have trodden on, I have given you, or I am giving you as I promised. Take note of where Abraham begins, in right? He moves all the way across to Haran, comes all the way down to Damascus, and then enters Canaan. He eventually goes out to Egypt, and then goes back into Canaan. All the place where Israel has been, God will give to them. That is what I think is behind this idea of the sole of your feet. Why do I say that? Now, take note of verse 4. If you can, okay, put up the next slide or the next picture. So you may have to scroll out, and then what you will see is what is in. No, go one back. Wat gaat daar aan? There's a little one. Okay, maybe this one will help. Where Salem is, if you zoom in, so from the Sea of Galilee, It's actually too small. Yeah, so what is being highlighted? No, scroll out, scroll out, scroll out. Go back, out, out. If you look at Canaan, so that area is what usually is considered to be Israel. Okay, so go to the next slide. The division of the land one with the, yeah, so zoom into that. Go across, come down, no. So get in Ur of the Chaldees and also Kadesh or Gaza, where the river Egypt is on the right. Can you see it? No. Scroll out so we can see the big picture. More. There, that's good. Okay. So notice where this map draws the possession of Israel from Ur to Egypt, the top bit of Egypt. That is the promise God makes to Abraham. Wherever you tread your foot, I will give you this land. Interesting, right? Wherever Abraham's gone, which is from Ur, right up till the top, the area known as the Valley of the Sun, probably because it's so hot in Egypt, right next to Hades. So right up till that area is granted to Abraham. Okay, so go to the next slide. This is modern day Israel. You can see it on between 1 and 2. That's Israel. The previous slide shows you the area from Kuwait up till the tip where Cairo is, right down to, what is that? The Fertile Crescent. That area has been promised to Israel. Do they occupy it? Not at all. They don't. Notice what verse 4 says. I have given to you from the wilderness of Lebanon. Do I have a map that includes Lebanon? I think it was the first map. No, I didn't include that. So it's in of the Chaldeans, right up to Jordan. So no, it's okay. I will use that Lebanon because it's closer to the Lebanon in the one map that I have. All right. So verse 4 says, from the wilderness of this Lebanon as far as the great river and the river Euphrates. Where's the river Euphrates? So if you go back a couple of slides, if you can, to the one that says the world of Abraham. Go back. Okay, so zoom in. And then if you follow there it is. Okay, so listen again. From Lebanon, which is up, to the river Euphrates, which I believe that would be east, right? All the land of the Hittites and the great sea toward this, going down to the sun, shall be your territory. Where's the valley of the sun? It is where Egypt is. So this verse outlines a greater area than just Canaan. So what God is doing here in verse 3 is not saying that where you will walk, Joshua, I will give you the land, but everywhere where Israel have been, I will give that land to them. I think it's pretty clear. So the battle over that little sliver over Israel is a moot argument. If God has given and promised it to them, notice the slide that I got, I liked that one where it says division of the land during the millennium, because God will give them the land in the millennium, not now. They don't have it yet. They have never gotten the land from Ur right up to Egypt. They have never actually possessed that land. What you do see in the book of Joshua is that little sliver of Canaan which was promised to them, is being given to them, at least most of it, not all of it. Most of it is given to them, and so God fulfills what he promises to them regarding Canaan, but he doesn't fulfill what he promised to them regarding the promise he made to Abram. Is that clear? Make sense? Okay. So any questions or comments on that? No, I'm glad you understand that because a lot of people don't. So when we speak about the land in Joshua, and why I make this a big issue is because there are a couple of verses. For instance, go to see if I can find it. I know it's on the left side of my Bible. Chapter 21. And covenantalists and other non-dispensationalists, I don't promote dispensationalism as a paradigm in terms of how it is classically defined. I believe that God works differently in different dispensations, but he saves the same regardless of the dispensation. It is always by grace through faith in the Messiah. It is never by means of works, never by means of any other means. So I have a slightly nuanced view of dispensationalism. But regardless, those who are non-dispensational will point to this verse in verse 43 of chapter 21. It says, "Thus Yahweh gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it, and they settled there. And Yahweh gave them a rest on every side, just as he sworn to their fathers. Not one of all the enemies had withstood them, for Yahweh had given all the enemies into their hands. Not one word of the good promise of Yahweh had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass." Interesting. So, was it all fulfilled or wasn't it all fulfilled? Because here it says, all the land that he swore. So, all the land up till this stage, yes, has been fulfilled. But not all the land that God has promised to Abram has been given to Israel. There's nowhere in the Bible that you see they occupying from Ur to Egypt. There is no occupation of that nature. Why that is significant is because this verse is often used to say, well, everything that God promised to Israel has been fulfilled. The land promises are absolutely fulfilled. Oh, really? We are only in chapter 21, but then you get to the book of Judges, and you see that not all the land is actually occupied. So both can't be true. Either it's every aspect, every little nook and cranny of the land, or it's not. And so up till that stage, when that part of the book is being written, yes, God has absolutely fulfilled all that he has promised up till that stage, but not every aspect of the land is actually fulfilled or occupied. Okay, I'm going to end on that point. The next point is God changes Rahab. Any questions or comments? Any points of disagreement or points of clarity? Okay, so before you ask your question, let me ask a question, and then you can think about it, then I'll answer your question. Why is understanding the land promise and the scope of the land important to and for the nation of Israel and for us? Okay, so while you think about that, Peter, what's your comment?
Last question.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm curious as I can't find an answer anywhere. As Joshua goes to his land, it's clear that it says in Joshua that every one of the nations they go to, he puts them to destruction. He kills them, old and young, everyone. Where are all those bodies buried?
They weren't buried, they were burnt.
They what?
They were burnt.
They're burnt up. Okay.
Yeah, so...
Because that's a curiosity. Millions of people are being
Sure.
killed.
Some of them were killed and left, but part of the devoting to destruction was to burn the city. And so as the city burned, and you get the, what is it called, the tiles, right? When the mounts are laid up on top of each other, they find a lot of burnt ruins, and that's because Israel burnt it to the ground. And so part of the destruction is removing the memory of them, but also the legacy that they had in the cities. So they I think were burnt with the city, and so there's not a lot of bodies that remains. Yeah, I never actually thought about that, but yeah. Okay, so my question: why is understanding the land important to the nation of Israel and also to us as God's people for today? Kenan, what do you think?
No answer.
You're going to call a friend?
I think it probably relates to God's promise and covenant to the people.
Okay,
That
that's good.
it's still to be fulfilled.
Okay, so follow that train of thought. It's both about God's promise to his people and the element of fulfillment. So why is that significant? Anyone else? You don't have to answer. David.
To me, the importance is that if we don't have any biblical evidence of that promise having been fulfilled, you are left with a few options. One, it's either still to be fulfilled, or two, God has officially given up on Israel and handed over the promise to someone else. So then that obviously has very important implications.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So there are two options. Either God has divorced Israel, and then, which means the promises are no longer required to be fulfilled, or if there are no actual evidences of its fulfillment, which means it's still outstanding, like Kenan was saying. Anyone else? Cameron. So I want to comment on the divorce of God, or I should say the divorce of Israel. Let me hear your comment, and then I'll comment on that. Go ahead.
So I don't think I'm necessarily going to be adding anything new here, but it speaks to the theme of this book, which is God's faithfulness.
Amen. Yeah, there you go. That's exactly it. Did you want to say something? If God, is it on the same topic? Okay, then I'll wait. Go.
Well, it comes down to is it on? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Does God keep his promises? If we're the elect, if God has saved us, God will keep us.
Yeah,
But if he couldn't keep Israel,
good point.
if he couldn't keep his promises to them, how can we trust that he'll keep his promises to us?
All right, so on that issue, it's supposedly a can of worms, which is what David mentions. The second option is God divorces Israel and then gives up on them, which makes him, or he devotes himself to another. Who do you think God would replace Israel with?
The church.
The church. And so that is the alternate option. So then the church replaces Israel. And in that sense, the promises is no longer required to be fulfilled, but God can then transfer the promise to this new wife. Okay, so did you want to say something?
If you take on the view of divorce, you're also questioning God's sovereignty, his omniscience, his omnipotence. Because if God doesn't know what's going to happen, then how can he truly be God?
Yeah, so in terms of, yes, him predicting that he would fulfill it, that's an absolute. If God says he's going to do it, it will probably happen. But it does impugn the sovereignty of God in that he said he was going to do something and he didn't do it. Okay.
So the one other question I've had for a while is, what would you say about the option of God didn't break his promise but expanded his promise and said, not even though you have been unfaithful, not only do I give you from the Euphrates to Egypt, I give you the whole earth. So to say there won't be in this earth a future fulfillment, but in the new earth,
Okay.
his people have everything.
Yeah, that's a good point. Does he expand the land beyond the borders of Israel, to Egypt? So that promise is specifically to the nation of Israel, and they will get that land according to the fulfillment of Scripture. Secondly, if God expands it to the entire world, that is a different element of reign. That's not just Israel. The millennium is primarily focused on Israel. Both the Great Tribulation period, or the Tribulation period, Great Tribulation period, and the millennium is actually focused on Israel. It's his judgment on their rejection and his fulfillment on his promises all come together during that 3 periods. The reign over all the earth is given to whom? And his glory shall be over all the earth. Who's that? That's Christ. So yes, there is an element where it's not expanded. It's always been the goal that man has the capacity to rule over all the earth. That is in Genesis chapter 1. In Psalm 8, God says that, let's just turn there. You'll see the same truth being expounded in Psalm 8. It's never been rescinded. O Lord, how majestic is your name. O Yahweh, our Adonai, how majestic is your name of all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouths of babes, you have, out of the mouth of babes and infants, you have established strength because of your foes. So it's about God to still the enemy and your avenger. Now, look at verse 5. Yet, you have made him, this is man, verse 4, this is man, a little lower than the heavenly beings, and crowned him, this is man, with glory and honor. That is going back to Genesis chapter 1:26 and chapter 2. You have given him, that is man, that is Adam, man, dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet, meaning that man's authority is to rule over the things of this world. And now he tells you exactly what he means. All the sheep, all the oxen, all the beasts of the field, all the birds of the heavens, and the fish of the sea, whatever passes alongside of it, along the paths of the seas. Oh Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. Who is he talking about there? That is a quotation from Genesis. That is not relating to the reign of Christ. Christ will reign over all things, over all people, over all nations, but man is to reign over the world. Man is to reign over the earth. There's a distinction between Christ's dominion, and this is applied to Christ in Hebrews. Christ's dominion is over all people, over all nations, over all things, but man's dominion is over all that God created. We don't get to reign over the nations. That is his reign. So yes, there is an expansion of Christ's reign over all the earth because that glory belongs to him alone. But the nation of Israel get to reign within the land or the scope that God has given to them because that's the promise that is made to them. So I don't think there's a replacement. I don't think there's a deviation. I don't think that God has another plan in view. It has always been this plan that Israel will get their land and man will get to reign on this earth. And the only time where we see man having dominion over the work of God's hands will be in the millennium. So then we get to reign with Christ and God's people, Israel, over all that God has made, but we don't get to reign the nations. We get to share in his reign over the nations. There's a difference between that. All right, my time is up. Sorry it went so long. Any other comments, points, questions? That is it's a good point of discussion. It takes us down a number of rabbit holes, but hopefully I was clear enough. You may not agree with me, but that's between you and the Lord. So, all right, let me close in prayer. Father, thank you for your goodness and your goodness displayed in your word to the nation of Israel. You've called them, you've sustained them. They still remain your people. The battle over land is a lost battle because the land belongs to you. And we know that the world sides with Palestine. They are not your people. They have never been your people, and you do not have a covenant with them, but you do have a covenant with Israel. You will preserve them until the day of Jesus Christ, and you will fulfill your promise to them. We are thankful to that, thankful to you for that, because if you could not, as Robert said, fulfill and keep a promise to your people of the past, then what guarantees that you will keep your promise to us as your people today? Thank you for your faithfulness, which is highlighted in this book, and help us to be encouraged by it, to know that you are a God who keeps his word, and you will absolutely keep your word to us. So we give thanks to you now in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you for your time.